If you folks could please sit down. We have a presentation tonight. I'm Don Hardy. I'm the planning director. I just wanted to do some introductions of our staff and our consultants tonight, and setting the stage for why we're here. We have Jamie Stickle, who is our economic development director here. And IT tonight. Emma Poricolo, our associate planner. Steve Faust with 3J. Todd Chase with FCS. Tim Wood with FCS. Appreciate you coming in tonight. Absolutely. 3J is a firm. I'm not really sure. I'm going to have go ahead, Steve.
3J.
Hi, Steve Faust with 3J Consulting. We're a land use planning, public involvement, and civil engineering firm. And we are leading the consultant team that is assisting the city with the housing portion of these projects.
And FCS is Financial Consulting Solutions, and we specialize in infrastructure finance and land use planning.
Thank you. I apologize for the acronyms. I didn't know what those meant, but land use and outreach and economics, and those are the two focal points for tonight's discussion. The state of Oregon has a process called a housing needs analysis and also an economic opportunity analysis. The city of Canby applied for grants for those processes, and those processes are to look at the 20-year horizon for growth in the city of Canby based on population projections from Portland State University. So it's basically to look proactively at the future and housing needs and land needs in the city. It's to look at affordability as well, and to look at ways the city can make housing more affordable in the current climate where housing is out of reach for many. It's also to look at things probably more specifically for what the future of Canby will be, and looking at things like, will there be a place for my children to live here that they can afford? And those kinds of items in looking into the future. There is going to be a presentation tonight that will be led by FCS by Todd, which will give more of an overview and in-depth piece. And then we're going to break into an open house. We're going to move the chairs over this way. And we have a number of boards. This process we're about midway through the housing and economic opportunity assessment. We have an advisory board. Ultimately, this all goes before the council as a recommendation, and the council would be reviewing and adopting both the housing strategies and economic opportunity strategies. That's the beginning of this process. I'm sorry, it's sort of hot in here. The air conditioning is not working so well, I don't think. Part of what this leads to ultimately is that it's the beginning of a process to look at the comprehensive plan update, which is also necessary to be updated in the city of Canby. It's from 1984, so it's about 38 years old. So that this leads into the comprehensive plan process and dealing with land. And in specific, we'll be looking at things like, what's the population projection that's anticipated in Canby? How does that get accommodated within Canby, or expansions of boundaries around Canby? Same with employment. Those are the objectives that we're looking at tonight. And part of the employment question is, what kind of employment? Where should that be? Where should that be located? Looking at employment from the perspective of hopefully having people be able to work here and live here. That would be the ideal situation in terms of looking at that in the future. With that, just one question Todd wanted me to ask is if we could get a show of hands on business owners here tonight that are present. Thank you, sir. And residents, I'm assuming everybody else is residents here. Okay, gotcha. Just to get an idea. Thank you so much. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Todd, and we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions after the PowerPoint, please let us know. Some of the answers will be presented after the meeting. We also have a comment form in the back. We'd really want your input on that. And there's also a website. On our website, there are the same forms and more information on our website as well. There's a lot of information. We're trying to boil it down so it's not fuzzy for folks here, but essentially looking at the future of what Canby will be in 20 years. Todd.
And there's water and cookies in the back, and so you should feel free to water yourself and get a little sugar, and I turned the air conditioning down so it should be more comfortable.
Well, we're really here to listen to your comments tonight, but I wanted to give you a brief overview and summary of what this information is trying to convey. I got to work on this project in Canby 28 years ago. So this is kind of my second go around. And it's great to see all the positive things that have happened over the last 2 or 3 decades here. When we had this meeting 28 years ago, I think we were in a crowded, tiny city hall. And the attendance wasn't nearly as good. So really happy that you could be here tonight. And we got through this pandemic. Hopefully, most of it is behind us now. And we start thinking about the new normal and whatever that is. That's for you to describe to us what you want it to be for your city. We'll talk a little bit about why we're here. Don mentioned a bit of the overview, but I want to explain how this fits in, this housing and employment work fits into the overall comprehensive plan and transportation system planning that's going to happen over the next 2 years in Canby. We have information that conveys the remaining amount of buildable land in the urban growth boundary, which is a boundary that's a little bit bigger than the city limits. And it's a boundary that was set many, many years ago, probably 20 plus years ago. So the city could begin to plan transportation, sewer, water, parks inside that boundary as it grows. So it kind of helps contain the growth, helps contain the cost of infrastructure over time. And then we're going to talk about a brief kind of preliminary findings between the land supply and the land demand inside the UGB to see if there's anything we can conclude based on what we know so far about whether you need to potentially expand the boundary, which you haven't really done for, like I mentioned, for 2 or 3 decades. And that's a big decision that comes out of all this work. That question alone is one we hope to answer through this work. And then, or whether you need to change the zoning in certain locations or create new zones to accommodate a different type of style of development. We'll talk about policy strategies and options a little bit at this meeting, but that's mostly going to be at the next meeting once we understand the relationship between land needs and land availability. Next. So how this all fits together. In Oregon, we do try to look ahead 20 years in these comprehensive plans, even though we don't update them every 5-10 years. We take a long time sometimes between updates. But to get there, we have to complete what's called an economic opportunities analysis, which is a 20-year look at job growth in Canby and how much land we need to accommodate those types of jobs you want to see here. Same with housing needs. We look at the housing supply, the inventory, the projected need for new housing based on the population growth forecast that's been a coordinated forecast between the state, Clackamas County, and the cities weigh in on that. And that's something that is kind of set. We're kind of given that population number and we have to work with it. And so we convert that population into housing and different types of housing into different types of income levels, basically, whether it be a starter home, like a townhouse or cottage home, or whether it be an apartment, or whether it be a detached home. And so we try to understand the need for all kinds of housing. And that information will feed into the transportation system plan, which is a very detailed modeling exercise of the trips that's going to be potentially generated by growth in different parts of the city and how those trips require mitigation or new roads or intersection improvements, as well as bike lanes and sidewalks and other types of multimodal connections to serve the residential neighborhoods that grow and the employment areas that grow over time. As that information is being conducted, there'll be a comprehensive plan update to try to look at your code, your building code, your zoning map, your zoning categories, your height restrictions, parking requirements, all those things kind of feed into that with new policies associated with different chapters in your comprehensive plan. Tonight, we're really focused on 2 chapters, housing and employment, or the economy. As this happens, Department of Land Conservation and Development is kind of at the table. They're helping fund this project. They will tell us if we're kind of going down the right path or getting too far astray from what the state land use rules require. We've done this in probably 20+ cities, so we understand kind of the amount of coordination that's required with DLCD staff and city staff and ODOT and other county staff as well. But that could lead to an urban growth boundary expansion. That's a whole nother conversation. Where should that occur? How much land? What's the cost of serving it? The return on investment to the community. So that's all these things happen after we're done with this work, and our work will be finished early next year for these 2 elements. Then we kind of get into the meat of the transportation planning and the comprehensive plan. So that's an overview. As part of the housing needs analysis, tonight we're going to talk about the housing needs forecast for 20 years, your buildable land inventory for housing based on current zoning, and what we consider to be vacant land. It's not necessarily marketed today, but in theory, it could be subdivided if the property owner wants to subdivide it, and there you could add another house or 2. So we have to count all that land up. The land needs is based on the population growth forecast and the housing related to that population need. And then we talk about the relationship between the 2 and begin to shed light on what policies might the city want to consider as we move forward in this process next year. For the economic component, it's really your opportunity to create a new vision for the community. Like I said, this vision it was revisited about 10 years ago. And I know the council has weighed in on it over the years off and on. And, but it's, what types of jobs you'd like to see here? How do you want the downtown to feel 20 years from now? Where do you think employment growth should happen? How would you like that to occur? The urban land requirements to meet the job growth forecast can be a big range in communities. Communities are allowed to have aspirational desires. So if you really want to see a certain type of employment here, certain type of use that may not be here currently, let us know, and we can begin to look and see if that's a viable use to be considered as part of this process. Or like things just the way they are, and you don't want to see much more job growth, that's another slant on this whole thing. And City of Wilsonville, we did this a few years back for them, and they had the same discussion. Should we go with the low growth employment growth forecast, or medium or high? They wanted to be, land efficient, so they went with the low. And so it's your prerogative to weigh in on those types of issues. We consider the buildable land just like we did with housing, but this time we're looking at mostly light industrial commercial properties for job growth. There's also some mixed use that can happen as well. And then we look at priority populations and the needs that they may have with respect to job growth in the community, opportunities related to future employers that might move here, or businesses. Those can kind of help define what policies go into the comp plan as well. I've worked in communities where they've actually had local hiring requirements for contractors on city projects or other projects that involve city funds. And so, those policies can make themselves make their way into comprehensive plans. There's a number of opportunities for community participation. Tonight is probably one of the first, but as Don mentioned, there are surveys, online surveys. You can email Don or Jamie, and I'm sure that information will get back to the project team. And all this is going to point towards policy goals and objectives, which I think will be a point of conversation in the fall when we get there, right? Also, so the city had a number of goals and actions that the council has adopted in the past. We're not starting from scratch. There's been a lot of time and attention focused on how Canby should grow. and what types of areas they want to focus on. So you could go into some of these background documents that are Don and Jamie can provide you and see what was done in the past. But a lot of the area or focus areas were to align available resources with future development and growth areas. Cities don't have unlimited money, so you really want to focus your growth on the most efficient locations for that growth to occur. You want it to occur down in wetlands or up on hills or things like that are hard to get to and hard to serve. I'm not going to go into all these tonight, but just suffice it to say that there's a number of council goals and actions that we can highlight. I think there must be at least 20 of them. So we've done some outreach to date. We've done a number of interviews. We have committees formed for both the housing project, the housing analysis, needs analysis, as well as the economic opportunity analysis. And these stakeholder groups have met 2 times since we began the project. They helped us define who we should be talking to outside of these rooms, just to make sure we get their input along the way. If you have other suggestions of people we really should be talking to because they can't make it to a meeting or don't have time to fill out a survey, please let Don and Jamie know, and we'll make sure we reach out to them. But yeah, you can see on the list, there's a number of nonprofits. There's Adopt Center, Bridging Cultures, some realtors, developers, folks like that we want to reach out to. And we've already talked with some of them. So the first section is on housing needs. And so here's the population growth forecast that we have to meet to make the state happy. Might not make the city happy, but it's going to make the state happy. So we need to accommodate another 5,931 people over the next 20 years based on these growth forecasts that have been adopted and coordinated. You can see we're at 18,700 roughly today. And that will take us up 24,586 in 20 years. So relative to a lot of places we work, this is still a nice kind of medium-sized small town character. It's not going up to 40 or 50 or 60 or like Bend. It's still, from my perspective, still manageable. Pardon me? Where do I live? I live near Westland.
Can I ask you a quick
Sure.
question about making the state happy? Is that because we took a housing grant from the state,
Well,
so we're obliged to make them happy?
all cities, to get state funding, you have to have a comprehensive plan that's up to date. And funding could be in the form of transportation dollars, or it could be in the form of grants for community development projects. Every city has to make the state, has to meet those requirements. And so this is an opportunity to look at those and see if they're realistic. If those requirements aren't realistic, we can go back to the state and say, our community thinks we're going to grow a lot faster than this. That's the case on the coast. A lot of communities feel that way. But you might feel differently. So we have to show the state that if we want to change zoning, for example, we need to show that we can accommodate 5,931 people at least with our current zoning and our current urban growth boundary. And it shouldn't be too difficult to do.
Could you address on the zoning, changing zoning? Does the city feel that it owes the present residents that got and built homes here under particular zoning to change that zoning at will, or the city changing the zoning at will, just to meet those criteria that you want for other residents? Do you feel that the city has an obligation to its current residents versus changing at will?
Great comment. And before I go to you, sir, I wanted to answer your question a little more specifically. Portland State University is using a demographic forecast. It's about 1.3%. That's not very high when you look at the other metro jurisdictions that are probably around 2% growth rate. So it probably understates, this number probably understates what will be realized in 20 years. So just to that point, it's not that we're having to be obligated to the state. It's rather there's a population reality here that if there's nothing done at all in terms of expansion, essentially we have the same population. So it's about accommodating that population. Hopefully that answers your question. So it's really about, this is how all the jurisdictions do it in the entire metro area. Look at what's forecasted for population, which generally is pretty accurate, although it can be less than that. I've seen other jurisdictions and it's really difficult if your population is greater than that, because you end up still having the same issue. So that really is about looking at the future in terms of what the demographics will be. Basically, you know, folks having kids here, people moving in here, those things are all factored into that. Sir, to your question, just wanted to say that recognizing existing zoning, that's an important thing for us to look at in terms of that issue. This is not about going and trying to rezone property that's zoned single family residential.
People make an investment in a home, R1, whatever, and the whole neighborhood's built up, and then there's a chunk of ground that hasn't been built on. And then the city comes in, oh, we're gonna put in a 3-story apartment building here. No. You know, that should be R1, like the rest of the neighborhood.
And I think, you know, that's part of the conversation. And I'm not just in disagreement with you. I think part of what needs to be looked at here is, and we'll get further into this presentation. There's a lot in this, but the issue here is that in looking at that population, and Todd has not gotten to this point, we need to do an urban expansion. So it's more likely that those areas that are expanded would end up needing to be looked at. And largely, I'm cutting to the chase a little bit here, most of the growth will be single family residential detached. So which is probably where you're living now, single family residential detached. That's where most of the population growth will be. Will there be some multifamily? Yes. It will not be the predominance of that. And so we need to look at those issues about where multifamily will go. It's part of the equation. It has to be looked at. But to your point, I mean, that's not the preference, is to go in and plant multifamily in existing single family areas. So I'm just wanting to set that as a stage point. This is not about taking over neighborhoods. Yeah, exactly. And so there's more to come. And also, this is a very long term. This is the very beginning of the process. This designation process will continue into the comprehensive plan update, which is probably a several year process that would end up including a lot of public involvement and review of those items. So just hopefully that answers your question. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I understand that you're not wanting to build multifamily homes. I mean, you are, but the majority is to be single family homes. But the majority of Canby residents that don't own a home right now cannot afford those single family homes. So in the future, when you're saying that you're building these homes for single family homes for people to live in, they're not going to be Canby residents that already live here because they can afford that. So that's why, how do you figure you're going to have more single family homes than multi-family homes? Because people can afford single family.
And Todd will get into the demographics of that just on a very high level. I mean, great question. Some of this gets into single family product that is smaller lot sizes, still single family. There could be opportunities here for things like row houses that are condominium style that would be part of the mix as well. Part of it is the city doesn't really control the market. We're trying to influence the market to an extent to be more affordable. Totally understand your question in terms of the escalating cost of housing. We're one input to that, and part of that would be looking at how do we encourage those types of developments through the city's strategies that would encourage developers to be looking at that more specifically.
Yeah. You want to keep our residents here versus having people, like, say, for instance, from Portland say, oh, well, Canby, yeah, it's kind of, not here, it's expensive as important so we can buy here. So we actually want to keep our residents here versus making it affordable for everyone else outside of Canby.
And right now, I mean, it's the dynamic, unfortunately, Canby is pretty much in the same price bracket as most of the rest of the area. I mean, it's unfortunate, but it used to probably be more that way. But the market it's challenging everywhere, just is. So good point. And there's a gentleman in the back, and I'll go to you next. Yes, yes, sir.
I was going to bring up, I know the standard size lots require 6,000.
Yep.
square feet. But would you go down to a micro and a nano for the single family or single person living situation?
It's like clusters is what you're speaking of. And I think that's part of the discussion. I mean, the advisory group that we have is going to have to weigh in and look at those issues. The input here from the citizenry is one of the important points. And I want to make that clear that we're not planning to do anything without public transparency. But I mean, if that's something that people want to look into and is something that's desirable, I think a lot of this comes down to good design standards. I mean, it comes down to something that looks good. You drive by it and it still meets a need. And I think that's perhaps one of the larger concerns, that it's not just putting a lot of density in without a lot of care. And so to your question. Yeah, you had a question.
Since we've gone down the rabbit hole of questions.
Yeah.
The slide that you showed regarding the feedback or input from people, I didn't see citizens on it and residents on it. And that to me is like, should be the number one. And I understand business and operate, all of that is important. But the people that currently live here, whether it is multiple dwelling, whether it's individual homes, it seems like really a strong venue to get people here. I feel like it was very difficult to know this meeting was happening. And I just think that needs to be, people that currently are residents need to really have a say, not just a small representation of, say, 1% of the population. We have almost 17,000 people, and it should matter what they say. And there's only us here.
And to your point, I think many of the people on the committee are their residents as well. They're wearing several hats. They may have a designation, but they're also on that. They're also decision makers, planning commissioners and city council members. So I don't want to discount that at all. Totally important to have the citizenry here. And I think that's part of the reason we have the meeting tonight, and we're going to have subsequent meeting and input on this. It should be a robust discussion. I think getting the message out further is important. I think there's not been a lot of discussion perhaps on growth globally for some time here in the city. I think my objective here is to have a broader brush of public outreach, including the newspapers, so that it's a key topic. We're not hearing about Malala or what's going on in Clackamas County, but maybe more so what's happening in Canby when you look at the newspaper, when you're reviewing that. So to your point, totally agree on that. And I think the balance here is we're trying to not have 40 people on a committee and because we can't get the thing done, but at the same time get representation that does in fact accurately portray.
Input.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Not workers.
No, I agree. And we have comment forms in the back. That's the first, that's absolutely going to be weighed in. Online surveys are there, et cetera. So we can take more questions. Todd, can you expedite the?
Sure. I think.
Okay.
We'll have plenty of questions as we move forward. We'll take breaks between each section.
Well, and some of the information you present might answer some of people's
That's true,
questions. So
too. Good point. Well, this slide just shows that the city has more people leaving for jobs than coming in for jobs every day. And so there is some importance to having employment locally so people don't have to drive to wherever to go to work. And that's why we like to look at housing in relation to employment at the same time. Next slide, please. And this one shows how home values have been rapidly increasing. That's been a regional problem for the Northwest for some time. It's also a national issue. City of Canby home prices, I believe, went up 14% between December 19 and 2021, and then it jumped another, probably another 15% last year, June to June. So I think part of the problem too is there aren't very many homes available here, really. People aren't selling. There's not a lot of new construction. There's some, but there's not enough keeping up with demand. That's for sure. And as a result, home prices have skyrocketed. And I hear the point about starter homes for young families, because I have kids and they, can they afford it? They probably couldn't afford to live in Canby, not now. But if there was a townhouse or a cottage home that was priced in the $350 range, two people working, maybe they get close. If it's a rental unit, now they're really close. So you definitely want to see housing for all income levels if we can do that. This chart shows what you have to make per year to be able to afford a home. Lawyers, average salary 128. You can have a community of lawyers, they can afford to buy the median home. But an engineer barely, making $85,000 a year. Two teachers working together, each making $60,000 or so, could probably afford one. But one teacher, probably not. So, it just shows you medical assistant could afford a max rent of only about $1,000 per month. There's nothing here that rents for that. And so you can begin to see the challenge before you to have an adequate housing supply. It's like that everywhere we work. But, Canby is definitely a desirable place. So prices are outpacing income levels. And that's the challenge we face. When we convert the housing growth into, or the population growth into housing needs, we conclude that we probably should aim for about 2,200 additional dwelling units over 20 years. If we can size this city, the urban growth boundary and the infrastructure to handle that, we should be in pretty good shape from a planning point of view. The difficulty is in trying to do that while balancing the community character, preserving existing neighborhoods and all that. And so that's going to be the big challenge going forward. In terms of mix, the majority of demand will likely still be in the detached home category, but they can be smaller lot sizes, and that helps make them more affordable. The cottage home category, some developers are building manufactured home parks that come in at a price point that gets below the median. You can have design standards to make those look really nice. So they have good aesthetics, covered garages, landscaping, and all that. So they can fit in well with the community. And townhomes, you don't see a whole lot of townhomes currently, but this is a new housing category for a lot of Oregon, but it's been around for a long time in the Northeast. And one of my first homes was a townhome. And I think, that's something I think we're going to see a lot more demand for, townhomes and duplexes. And they can also look pretty nice when you have good design standards. And of course, apartments with 5 or more units per structure, we're showing demand for about 300 to 370 to 400 or so. I'm sure the demand, because of pent-up demand, could easily be above that. But that's kind of what we're planning for through this effort. The economic opportunities, there's a lot of changes going on right now in the economy since the pandemic. Plus, we have an aging population with baby boomers or aging in the workforce starting to retire, seeing more demand for retirement communities in places like Canby is a great location for that. But the labor force participation rate has also been declining. So it's hard to hire workers these days, and the unemployment rate's at a historic low. A lot of people are working from home still, even though, it went from about 50% during the peak of the pandemic or higher. Now it's back down to like 15%, where we think it's going to stay for a while. And it's great that we can do meetings sometimes from our home, but I think there's a lot of value to having people come into the office or come into the shop, so that's going to continue. So we are seeing Zoom cities or cities that have great internet and fiber optics are becoming kind of a great location for businesses to focus investment on. And I'm not sure what Canby's capacity is there, but I've heard good things. So I think you're going to grow, kind of small business and home-based businesses to continue to be really a big attraction here. Housing costs are pushing people all around right now. Portland's costs are very high. You get in the inner Clackamas County, still well above Canby. So people are beginning to move out, as you know, to outer ring locations like Canby. And of course, incomes aren't keeping up. Our income has been growing about 3% per year over the last decade, while housing prices have been on about double digits. So that's been the big challenge. As far as job growth goes, when we look back over 10 years, most of the growth in Canby has actually been in metal manufacturing, healthcare, and a lot of construction related jobs and construction contractors that are based in Canby. And they might be working all over the region, but they're based in Canby. Professional, scientific, and tech services, more of an office engineering type position. And restaurants are starting to come back and food services are coming back. We might see more hotel growth in the near term. Of course, if Amazon comes in, we'll see some distribution jobs show up on this chart next time you look at it. But as far as the trend goes, the industrial job growth has been really, really strong here for the last decade. We worked on the Pioneer Industrial Park master plan years ago. It's still not fully built out, of course, but it's definitely been a great location for a lot of businesses to expand in Canby and add good paying jobs here in Canby. Retail trade's starting to really slow down. A lot of that's gone online, of course, but as you add households, you're going to add income in the community, and those people are going to buy goods and services, hopefully locally, and so that'll help bolster downtown as well as other businesses that are already here as you add more households. Services has been growing. It's health, professional, business services, and the government surprisingly has actually been shrinking during this time frame in Canby. Sure.
If you know that income is not keeping up with hospitality, what is your plan for more affordable housing? Don't see that on here.
Not yet, no. That'll be a conversation as we talk about those housing types that I mentioned. We need to figure out how the city can lower barriers to the construction of affordable housing in your community. Some communities are putting financial incentives for builders to build mixed income housing. So a certain percentage is available to people making, say, 120% or below the median income level. Those are all production strategies that we're going to talk about when we get into that phase of the project.
That's a long-term problem for society.
Mm-hmm.
And there doesn't seem to be an equation that actually addresses
Yeah.
a solution
Yeah.
for it. And I'm sure that we have the ability
Mm-hmm.
to create a solution. It's not being done.
Right. It involves a lot of partnerships between cities, nonprofit developers. It's a very difficult challenge, and every development, unfortunately, has to kind of piece it all together to make that development a reality. So there's no cookie cutter solution to that problem. And it's unfortunate because we face that all over the Northwest because it's so beautiful here.
Being no political will to do it.
Certainly not on the federal level. And, the state doesn't have the funds, counties and cities don't have the funds either. So we'll talk about during one of the next phases, we'll show you dozens of potential strategies. Cities can only do so much. They can only make it land, they can only create opportunities for the market to come in and build housing. Cities aren't gonna build it. And so, there's sometimes cities can create those opportunities by leveraging some of the land that they might own or that they might buy. There's different ways, but you're hitting the nail on the head because that is the biggest challenge to housing.
We create our own paradigm. We can create a paradigm that solves that problem.
Yeah, part of the solution is continuing to add high-paying jobs locally, because at least those jobs will pay some of the engineering levels and above, where they can at least afford to buy a house. If you come out of college or even get a 2-year degree, you could potentially at least afford one of the cottage homes that we talked about, and then as you advance in your career, you could afford another home. But it's a challenge all over. So there's questions. There was a question back.
I had one, in the past, because I, years before COVID, I came to an affordable housing, right? And this developer came in and he said, I'm a young guy and my family and I couldn't afford to live here. And I want to build something that we can afford to live in. And so he took off the stuff out of Holly and is building affordable housing. We have so many people come in here and say, we're building affordable housing, yet I don't know who it's affordable to. So I think when you guys decide to make your affordable housing, and I don't know, let's see, whoever, maybe you should talk to the community, what's affordable, because yes, I own a home, but it took us a while, because what's affordable to you guys in West Lynn or Portland or whatever is not necessarily affordable to the upcoming residents of Canby that maybe went to high school here or went to college and are coming back. So I think that the people that people that live here, the community should be weigh in on what's affordable, because these $650,000, $700,000 homes, $600,000 are not affordable.
Right. And then once again, there's only so much the city can do. And we'll talk about in a future meeting, all these policies, options that are available, and you can weigh in on which ones you think the city should try, because some are very proactive, in the sense of city's gonna co-develop a attainable housing development with the developer. And some are a little more passive, where we're just going to require a certain percentage to be available, deed restricted to people earning 120% or below of the median income. So there's a big range of strategies that you can implement over time.
What is 120% of median income in 2020?
Today, it's like 55,000. I think it's about 55.
67,000.
Oh, is that what it is? 67? 67. Thank you. Stand corrected. So the max person earning 120% would be able to afford a rent of about $1,600 at 30% of their income going to housing, which is the housing and urban development threshold for what's considered to be affordable. And this is before rates bumped up last month, but that would have been able to afford a mortgage of about $340,000, which would not be able to buy a house here.
And just to interrupt for a second, I'm sorry, but for information, say the apartments that are being built off of Holly, those are gonna be $1,800 a month. And we're building them for like one house case.
Yeah.
So I mean, you can see that 1,800 is starting
Right.
at that 1,600.
Yep. Yep.
I think now apartments are being built, that's like a house.
Oh, I don't know, I'm talking about how we have the outside house.
Let's see.
That's it.
So I'm going to continue with the employment conversation. Over the last, I want to look at this 10 years in terms of businesses by size, 0 to 1 employee, 2 to 10, 11, 25, 26, 49, 50 to 100, 100 plus. You've added, you went from 481 total businesses to 616 total businesses in Canby. And you can see you got growth in every category, most of it being businesses under 10 employees. So it's kind of the smaller, nimble business, the supply chains to the larger businesses. But you've also added, at the same time, at least 4 to 6 larger businesses as well. So it's pretty rare when I go to a community and see that type of diversity in the number of businesses and the types of businesses they're attracting. What we think, yeah, we think that's an asset. We think that your diversity is strength, and you will continue to see most growth in economic terms in the small and medium-sized business establishment. But at the same time, you realize these top 10 or 11 employers, they generate over 233 million in annual gross product for this region, the state. They pay above average wages, and they generally want to keep growing. They don't want to shrink. And so ideally we can accommodate their growth over time. And there's supply chains. And it can be, we've attracted businesses and focusing on energy, high tech, metals, manufacturing, a lot of construction, warehousing, food processing. You have a great mix of business types here for a relatively small community. And we've been talking to some of the businesses, and they love being here. But you know, at the same time, as the community grows, they want to make sure they can still attract employees that can afford to live here. If we look at the job growth and we go out in 20 years, what our models are indicating is that, you know, we could go anywhere from adding 3,000, well, we're currently at 7,700 jobs in Canby. We think, based on these growth trends, we could go between 3,300 and 7,200 additional jobs if you had the land and if you could serve it, and if it worked for the community in the right way where you preserve the current neighborhood character and all that. And that's the big challenge. The biggest range is in industrial. The other categories are pretty tight in terms of what we think the growth will be related to housing growth, generally with services and retail and government. And so that we can predict those pretty well, but the industrial ones are harder to predict because those businesses might move here from other states. They might be onshoring from other countries. They might, like Canby, over other locations in either Oregon, California, or Washington. And so, you know, that's where it's a little bit more of a wider guess in terms of types of industrial jobs you might be able to attract here. So what it converts into land needs is a need for about 264 to 600 acres of vacant, unconstrained land for growth. That means it means it's not a wetland, it's not a hopefully it's not prime farmland, but yeah, it's probably a green field somewhere. Yeah. And so the next step we do, the other one question for today is, next slide, Steve,
Okay.
is generally what kind of business do you think works well in these categories? Should we, you know, can the city limit the amount of large users that move here by keeping the UGB tight and the parcel size configurations below 8 to 20 acres per user? Or, you know, do we go ahead and make sure we can accommodate the large businesses as well as the medium and small ones by having an adequate size of urban land and right parcels, flat land, served with good transportation? It's definitely takes many years to be able to accommodate the large users. You have to have roads, infrastructure, the urban growth boundary, the community has to be behind it, you know, and I think we're down to, I think the next slide shows, how many sites we actually have left. So we'll get there. Talking about your land now, this is your urban growth boundary. You can see the red boundary around the city limits. And the city currently has over 3,000 acres in it. And the urban growth boundary adds another 450 acres on top of your city limits. So your urban growth boundary has room to accommodate a lot of this growth. So we don't need to bump it out, you know, 450 acres. But we do need to consider how much additional land we need for the residential housing and for these jobs. And that's our next step. So we've taken into account all these developments that are considered to be kind of in the planning pipeline. There's a number of them. I've spread around the city, and they're indicated in these hatching you'll see on the map. About 627 housing units are already in the planning pipeline in the city. So it's happening. 2 large senior housing developments are also being kind of going through the planning process. So that'll, that's kind of near term, and that will help meet some of that demand imbalance I was talking about. And then you have a number of industrial development expansions. We have the potential Amazon fulfillment center, and Columbia Distribution wants to expand. OLCC wants to do some additional expansion here. So there's a number of fairly large industrial investments also in the pipeline here. Yes.
So we have input, because the big caution is you go too much and then too much asphalt is needed.
Right.
And there's been a projection of an additional fund with people, but aren't we encouraging it by the big, are we promoting
Right.
that level of,
Yeah.
when,
Yeah.
because of its geographical growth boundaries, maybe Canby's not approved
Right.
for that, for the large, but how do we make our opinions?
Yeah. Well, that's
Is that
again,
just like online?
we're writing Tim's writing down what you just said right now, but there's there's online surveys. And if the city council eventually gets to hear, this input, and they will, along with other input, they can then make an informed decision about what to do. But of course, it's always a balance. We'd like to see the land inside the boundary. You've already invested in roads, water, sewer. You want to get a return on investment, the city does, for all those millions of dollars you've already spent. So ideally, we, see that land developed before you have to bump it out. And when you do bump it out, make sure you consider what other roads are we going to need? And is there a way to make it so that those trucks, if there are trucks, don't have to come right into 99 and they go right through the downtown core? Instead, they can maybe get out, in another way. And
Property to build the road set. Take the industrial out.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's,
Yeah, that's underway.
yeah, so those,
It is something that we're working on.
those big roadway projects take many years and lots of dollars. And so that's why, ideally, you get a handle on that through this type of planning. So in other parts, in other cities we work, you kind of set what's called trip caps, and so when an intersection hits this cap, you kind of begin to limit additional development activity until that intersection is improved, or at least in your plan and fully funded before you allow additional development to occur. So those are all the kind of conversations and decisions that happen in the next year or two. We have to understand how big is the challenge in front of us. How many acres are we talking about potentially? And so, I'll see all the questions. We'll open it up in a minute. Let's get just a couple more slides.
Yeah.
So the buildable land inventory, we've sorted it by vacant residential land, partially vacant single family land, redevelopment potential land, employment vacant land, partially vacant employment land. So we begin to dissect and sort the land based on mapping that we have available, and it all adds up to acres. And so what we found is that for the employment side, we have about 133 acres left that's considered to be vacant and buildable. As I mentioned, we needed between like 200 and 400 acres. So there probably is a gap of about 100 to 200 acres of employment land that you could consider for expansion somewhere if you choose to. And so that's the big finding on employment. And on residential, we concluded that you need about 140 to 150 acres of additional residential land that is in addition to your urban growth boundary, unless you want to change zoning to accommodate a lot of that growth inside your current UGB. So you have the option. You can change zoning inside the UGB, or we can look at ways to accommodate this growth adjacent to your UGB in a planned fashion. And those are the options that we're going to begin to explore through this process. Total, let's see, this is, up to 450 acres of employment land on the high end of the range. And it was about 150 acres on the low end of the range to accommodate the growth in commercial, industrial type of development. And that is where we are. So we have a lot to get input on now. You know, what type of housing does Canby really think it needs more of? What are the barriers to housing development that you think developers are facing today? What types of businesses and jobs do you think Canby should try to accommodate? What about downtown? How should that look in 20 years? And what about the employment areas? How should that change? And that's all we have for that. Lots of questions.
Yeah, so our excuse me, thank you, Todd. What we envisioned was kind of conversations around these stations. We've got kind of the 20-year planning for growth station over here. We've got housing there and economic development over there. But Don, if you want to come up, if people have any other kind of clarifying questions or big picture questions that you want, want to ask now, let's do that.
Hear everyone's questions.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that is beneficial.
Yeah, I think that I can do that.
Can you tell us what other cities?
Okay, we're going to go with this person right here who's been waiting patiently.
I just wanted to make a couple general statements that state law requires us to grow. It's not an option to have a moratorium on growth, and we have to have a 20-year land supply. And so we're here to figure out how to do that. So the frustration that you feel that you don't want things to change, that's simply not an option, but we're here to help impact how we do it and so that it meets our needs. And the other thing I wanted to say is we've been a bedroom community for a long time in Portland. So we have had an imbalance in the amount of homes versus jobs. So our town is not wealthy because we don't have that tax income from businesses. And so expanding more businesses will give the city more money, not only to function, but possibly to help get lower income housing. And I think it's important for us to think about, are we looking to keep people from being homeless? Or are we trying to help people buy their first home? And I'd like to hear about if tax increment financing is an option to try to lower, whether it's deferring SDCs and stuff like that until the house is sold and then it's repaid to the city, you know, if some of that has been considered.
So just to reiterate quickly, so far we've been doing kind of the baseline research. We've been gathering the information we wanted to share with you so we kind of have a shared understanding of what the situation is today. And that's what we wanted to share with you tonight and hear from you on some of these questions. Our next step when we come back to you a few months from now is going to be a little more focused on, okay, here's kind of like Todd said, a full list, a comprehensive list of different actions and strategies that cities have taken in Oregon and elsewhere, and work with you to determine which of those strategies are the right fit for Canby. To the tax increment financing question.
Yeah, Canby's already used, of course, tax increment financing probably for this building and some other downtown buildings over time successfully. And I think it's a great tool to get ahead of private investment. And what it means basically, if you create a tax increment district, the future investment that happens there in terms of assessed value is captured by the city, the community, not kind of dissipated among many tax entities such as Clackamas County and others, but the city gets all the money. And you can then use that money to incentivize affordable housing through providing the road, sewer, water that leads up to it. You can buy sites with the money. The Urban Renewal Advisory Committee would determine how you spend the money, but it has to be in conjunction with an urban renewal plan that defines how all the intended uses of all those funds. But yeah, that's a great way to incentivize, or at least gives the city a new tool in the toolbox. Oh.
And just on the SDC question, great question. System development charges. And so those really go to help pay for infrastructure. Thank you, Todd. I mean, these acronyms are not known by everybody. That's clearly going to be on the table for discussion. I mean, the question really is about incentivizing. Had several conversations with home builders here locally. And like, the question is, well, what would make a difference in terms of that home price? Some of that relates to that. So for example, if you have, a smaller lot, I mean, maybe there's a proportional ratio versus a big lot with a big house on it. Something that's smaller has some sort of reduction to that, or townhomes have a reduction on that based on some ratio. That's still to be formulated. That those SDCs are going to be going up as well. So there's another discussion coming forth with the transportation system plan update that would it'll be part of the concurrent comprehensive plan update. Those will both be elevated because they need to be elevated based on keeping up with the cost of things. So those are all part of that mix. And just finally, to the point about the balance, I think that the point that was made is really important. Is housing is important here, but having a balanced city economy with employment and housing is really critical to the ultimate success of the community. Balancing those two is quite essential. Housing really doesn't pay for itself. That's part of the challenge here, is that employment has to be part of that mix for the city to be viable.
Yeah, so tax increment financing, incentives through system development charges, those are just two of the many strategies that we'll come back to you with next time to discuss at the next public meeting. Do we have, we'll go here and then to the back.
So I've been hearing about transportation development and all this stuff, and then some people are saying things are in the process. What is the guidelines or what's going on?
Here, why don't you use this? We'll have the speakers use
Okay.
this one, and I can.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie. So there currently is a transportation system plan the city has. That's going to be updated to reflect a 20-year horizon. That's out of date as well. So it's a 2010 transportation system plan. There's a question earlier, however, on part of that for Walnut Street and the extension of that. So the city is actively requiring developers to contribute to that road, and it will be built very soon. And the next final design, I think, is going through right now. I wouldn't be surprised if that construction started. I don't know the exact timeline, but in 23 for sure, I believe it will be underway. So that's moving forward. There is the focus of trying to look at concurrency, which is basically having concurrent roads and development consistent with development. So you basically are not outpacing growth with overloading roads and the level of what we call the level of service. So that's experienced by individuals when you go to a stop sign or a stoplight, and how much delay and time do you have to get through that? Do you get through in one cycle, or is it another cycle that you have to wait? There are specific measures that are part of that process that every development is weighed on. We have Oregon Department of Transportation that is 99E running through the city. They have their own what they call volume to capacity, and essentially there's a limit of that, and every development's weighed against that. Even though traffic appears to be increasing, and it is, the metric has to still be met. So I know there's a perception sometimes that traffic is getting horrible, but it's still within the confines of the limits. But longer term, there are those issues that need to be looked at, which is, if we're going to look at development and growth, additional growth, it has to be weighed out and measured with the need to meet the standard. And those are really set by ODOT, and the city doesn't really have a standard issue, but to basically define on 99, but we can control all the city streets. So those are things that are under the influence of the city. So there is definitely a plan that is in place now. What the big difference is in the 2010 plan is updating the transportation system plan costs for transportation to reflect current rates now. So on the Walnut Street, for example, because there were other intersections, I don't want to go too far astray here, but there were other intersections that were being impacted. There was a fee in lieu on top of the SDC, system development charge, that the city's requiring each developer. So the large warehouses, it's in considerable sum that they're paying in addition to the standard system development charge. Hopefully that was a short enough answer, but also got to your point.
We're just having everybody use the microphone,
Yep.
just in case anybody is hard of hearing. It also picks it up for our friends on Zoom and then the recording. So if you just bear with me, I'll be running this around. We're not rushing anybody. We've got time. So we'll make our way through all of the questions.
Thank you. Hey, before I make the comments and question that I had, you mentioned some other cities that you guys had worked with. Could you share with us real quick what some of those other areas that you've worked in on similar things have been?
Wow. Well, these types of studies in Oregon, I think we've probably done 20 or so in the last 10 years, most in the last 5 years. But let's see, Tim, where do we begin?
Just the cities we're asking about?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of for like a visual of like what kinds of areas have you already been in comparison to where we are and where we might want to.
I'll start with the ones that we've worked on together, which right now we're working in Winston, Oregon, Mount Angel, Oregon, Sweet Home, Canby. What's that? Coos Bay we're working in. We recently worked in Grants Pass and Roseburg. So
Who did you work with like 10, 15 years ago where we would see what happened? You know, like what's the past that we could look to today and say, oh, 15 years ago, they worked in X city and that's what's changed there. Because we're familiar with the general area and how certain areas have developed. And I guess that's kind of what I'm angling for is a curiosity of
I don't know.
recommendations versus what happened.
And Todd, maybe your experience, because I know you did some previous studies for Canby, might be helpful, just in context.
Well, yeah, like, I don't know if you were here earlier, but 28 years ago, I worked on Canby's urbanization study. And then about 12 years ago, we worked on the Pioneer Industrial Park Master Plan. And we were part of the original TSP team that planned, did that work Don mentioned 10 years ago. So we've been involved in Canby planning for a long time and I was at OTAC before FCS Group, so long time. But we do a lot in Oregon and Washington, and there's communities outside of Seattle, like Redmond, Washington, that kind of reminds me a little bit of Canby, because they were a bedroom community to Seattle and Bellevue, and then they became kind of a full community with lots of jobs. Of course, Microsoft is there now, but they have a great town center that they've created in the last 20 years. They've done a lot of mixed use development, kind of like the Dahlia building in their downtown, which has created a real vibrant downtown now. And that's I think they've retained a lot of the community character and neighborhood charm that they had 20 years ago. Yet the city is very proactive about deliberate planning.
Okay, so the actual comments of question. So I think it's great that we're looking at getting more affordable housing and multifamily units into the area because that I think is what just Oregon and the metro area needs. My concern is about actual affordability. We see apartments going in that cost as much as my $400,000 mortgage. And I had to be making 150 grand to get that mortgage. And that's not affordable for individuals in apartments. It takes a lot of individuals in an apartment to afford that kind of rent. And those people need cars because no matter what kind of development we're trying to do locally in Canby, people aren't all going to be working in Canby. There's a very high likelihood they're going to be traveling to other areas for employment. So what I would ask for you guys is to do two things. When we qualify good jobs, what is a good job? Is an $18 an hour Amazon warehouse job a good job? because that pays 37 grand a year. That's 100% of your money would have to go just to paying rent, not to paying for gas or for food or for insurance or for just any part of living. So if that's the case, we need to make sure that there's a reasonable amount of parking available, because everybody says, oh, parking requirements are just going to keep going down. We're not going to have a livable community if we have one parking space for a house that's going to have 6 adults in it, because that's what it actually costs to live in a place. So I don't want to see Canby be like the rest of Portland Metro. I don't want to see it especially like Portland Central. I saw how much it's changed in the last 15 to 20 years because of poor planning for the realities of cars. We're doing better. People want to drive less, but we are a bedroom community. We are not connected to Metro. You cannot hop on the Max. You cannot hop on the West train. You can't do jack, but drive a car. We have the CAT, which is a really nice service for people really locally here in Canby, but you're not going to take the CAT to go to your job in Wilsonville or in Tigard. You're going to be taking a car. And so I just don't want to see Canby be overwrought by people who can't comfortably live in the town. And then, that's just really my biggest concern.
Yeah.
So when you guys are looking at housing mixes and the recommendations, if you guys could maybe compare it to what is actually the average income for people in Oregon and in this area. So you're saying, oh, most people make, I don't know, maybe 40% of people make less than 60 grand a year. Okay, cool. Like, look at that. How do you serve the realities of what people actually make now? Because there's not going to be so much economic growth that we're all of a sudden going to lose all these people who are at the lower end of income. They need a place to live. And when they don't have a place to live, they're going to start in their cars and they're going to end up on the streets. And that's horrible for everybody.
Yeah.
So
there were kind of thank you for all that. There was kind of 3 pieces there. I think we have done that's what we're presenting here tonight is the information that we've gathered, like you said, what are people making here, and using those numbers to figure out kind of what the goals of the city are, with remembering that there's only much the city has control over. There's a lot of factors here. The parking question is a good one. I think the folks in Canby recognize that there isn't quite the infrastructure that there is in downtown to allow people to not have a car. At the same time, there's 2 sides of the coin, and fewer parking spaces does often equate to a lower housing price. So there's balances that we need to look at when we're looking at how much parking is the right parking. And then I know you had something to say, Don, but I wanted Todd to comment on the living wage part of that she started off with.
Yeah, and when we look at the job growth by type of industry or type of sector, in the industrial sector with manufacturing jobs generally pays well above the median average. And those jobs can be accommodated to the business park and expansion of those business parks over time. Even a wholesale distribution business. Tim and I have that in our report. We were surprised to find that the average wage in the wholesale distribution is actually well above average. Yeah, a lot of the jobs are entry level and they don't pay great, but there's a lot of management jobs, supervising jobs, accounting jobs, supply management jobs that do pay really well. So you're not going to find the one business that's going to provide the right jobs for everyone. But yeah, if you can accommodate enough different types of businesses, I think you'll have a shot at accommodating entry-level jobs as well as people that can make enough money to be able to afford a $400,000 house. That's our hope.
That's not, and that's the problem that I think you guys come from outside the town are understanding that we do have this issue where $400,000 is not affordable. We have teachers over at Canby that start off less than $45,000 a year. So even if you have a married couple that's a teacher, they cannot afford $400,000 a year.
Yeah, and And we're really not saying that. I think if I could redefine the situation, really it's coming down to looking at what is the affordability. To your point, totally agree that that's why we're here tonight, is to start looking at that and to see what influence the city can have on that situation. City is one player in a dynamic private sector market that's driven by private sector. The city has influence on that. And I think some of that is in relationship to looking at what we're discussing tonight. If the council decided to say, let's go ahead and reduce or modify system development charges for multifamily projects in concert with some agreement with a developer that would set the rates for rents, that's one possibility, or those kinds of issues. I totally agree that market rate apartments may not be affordable to the average person. We can't control that. That's the market's driving it. But to the point of the compatibility and the design elements, I think that's a critical piece. We're defining that now. I think there are different areas in different parts of the city. Some of this is going to be the comprehensive plan that subsequently follows this, getting into sub areas of the city. In one area, it may make sense that there's an assumption you have on-street parking. In another area, it may make no sense to have on-street parking assumptions. So those are the kinds of things that need to be looked at. I think the code probably needs some adjustment in relationship to those sub areas and in relationship to what the character of those areas are. That's what a lot of communities do. They define those areas specifically. So they're not really all cut of the same cloth. You have some geographic areas that you can park on the street and others that you can't. I think things in the code that could be adjusted is trying to look at design base that is something people like. I think there are some multifamily product in this community that I think is well designed. And I think most people would agree to that. So how do we make that the template for all developments? I mean, I think that's part of the challenge here, and also affordable and also diverse. And it's not just apartments, it could be row houses and those kinds of things. So those are all part of the mix. And we're not disagreeing with you at all. And we're not saying it's affordable. We're identifying the problem and seeing what we can do as a solution, what the city can do collectively, the city being ultimately the council and their directive based on the recommendations from the consultant and staff. And that's why you all are here tonight. And again, for those folks that came late, there's comment cards in the back. We want this to be a process where we take your input and try to modify it. Ultimately, council will be discussing this. So hopefully that gives a little more context and answers part of your question. Yeah, and a community survey. Yeah, yes.
We've got a question back here, and we'll keep moving through the crowd. You can raise your hand once the answer is done.
Can you talk a little bit about how many acres are needed for the residential? I saw the number for industrial, but when you were talking about the one for residential, I'm wondering if you've dealt with the impact of the country club, the fairgrounds, and is it the high school or the schools, the areas where they're being counted as residential when the use is not intending, at least in the near future, to be residential.
Great point. And we talked to DLCD, Department of Land Conservation and Development, about the golf course. And they're in agreement that it will not convert in 20 years. And the people that are on the golf course are also in agreement. It's not going to convert in 20 years. There's like 500 to 1,000 owners that are, so it's been removed. So that's not part of the base. Yeah.
And what about the fairgrounds?
Fairgrounds is public, so it's automatically removed. It's a public space.
And so what is the acreage from
We need about 140 to 150 acres of additional land for the job or the housing.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Ray Keene, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Canby Center. I work with low-income families here in Canby, with thousands of them. I just am the immediate past president of the Rotary Club of Canby, so I also work with folks who've lived in Canby for a long, long time. And I own a home in Canby, just a stone's throw from here, and love this town. It's a wonderful place. I'm getting to know this process. And one of my observations tonight is that this is a human challenge that has about 500 inputs going into it. Like if you think of it as a math problem, there's about 500 different moving parts to this thing. And I think tonight, these guys have done a great job of just expressing about 50 of those. And so just sharing, you know, from the standpoint of what we really ultimately need from my perspective is these kinds of conversations on a much more in-depth level so that we can get to some of those nuances that are so important to all of us, right? So I think the comments and the feedback are really good. We've heard tonight that there's a need for folks who can't afford to live in Canby. And we've heard tonight that there's a need for folks who have been here for a long time to not have their neighborhood upended, right? Both of those perspectives matter. And I think the best way for us to get there is these sort of conversations. So I just want to cheer the group on. Let's keep the conversation going.
And could we have our folks who are on the housing or economic development advisory committees that are here tonight raise their hand? Because I know we have a few. So thanks to all of you. And I just wanted your neighbors to see that.
And there are more than that.
Yes.
They just aren't here because some of this presentation they've heard before. And another thing I just wanted to note while I'm walking the microphone over is that I know that in the beginning there was like, well, where is everybody? You know, that we're just a small fraction of the people that live here in Canby. What most people didn't hear is that the consultants were so pleased with how many people had shown up. So Canby shows up time and time again. I've been here 10 years. I live in town. I work here for the city. We show up for each other, for ourselves, for the future. And so I think it's a really good start of a conversation. But, you know, tell your friend, and tell your neighbor, and tell your, you know, the person you don't like and you wish that they couldn't, you know, live across the street from you. We sent it out to the Canby Herald, the Canby Current, on our Facebook page. We sent it to all of our boards and committees. You know, that we use the tools that we had. But one of the things, and I've been working in communication for longer than I've worked here in Canby, which is just that one of the ways to best get the word out still is word of mouth. And so this is a great first step. I'm pleased with the results of how many people have come out, but I would love all of you guys to make sure you're filling out your sign-in sheet at the front, and we will email you the information. We'll make sure that we email you when the next meeting is. We'll email you that survey. My name is Jamie Stickle. If you don't know me and you put your name on that list, you'll probably hear from me a lot more than you'd like, but just about these things, I won't, you know, message you about other things. Okay, yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. Oh, and it is virtual, yeah.
I wanted to touch on the transportation area of it, and it says here there's going to be about 6,000 people by, I guess you guesstimated 2043. But my question is, it seems like as popular as this place is becoming, you might have more than that would be coming here to live. And as far as the transportation part of it, with 99 being such a gridlock, have you considered like a bypass to I-5 for all of the companies that the possibility of manufacturing or all the businesses that would come in that would need that, and that would alleviate a lot of the traffic on 99 and all the damage that it would do to those roads. And I know it would take up maybe some farmland, just like the residential would. And I don't want to step on any farmland people. I know that's precious to them, but I mean, Newburgh had to put in a bypass because McMinnville, going through McMinnville, it was just stop and go. So I don't know what you would consider for the future for the transportation area, but it seems to me you're going to need a bypass of some sort to get that traffic to I-5 for north and south.
And those are all great questions. I think the transportation system plan is that there's an update to that will occur. And just to let you know about some near-term projects that Clackamas County is pursuing, which is Barlow and 99, that intersection. They're working on that design for improving that. And that as part of that, they've hired a consultant, Kittleson Associates, to evaluate that. And they looked at the Berg Parkway situation, which at one point there was a flyover kind of assumed that might occur. And those improvements that are going to be made at Barlow and 99, and then there's Arndt Road as well as part of that as well, be a roundabout. The consultant Kittleson was identifying that with those improvements, that within the 20-year horizon, those would basically essentially take care of that, the need of what a flyover would be. And those are really expensive to do and difficult for the city to pay for it on its own. And so it would be difficult from a federal highway matching perspective to get those funds. But I think there is a near term, at least that direction going Barlow and 99 to address that. The other end of the town at Haynes is another item altogether. Those are again part of those discussions with ODOT and in terms of the levels of service that go with that. I think the Oregon Highway Plan is not intended to be changed to change those levels of service, although there will be improvements to the Oregon Highway Plan to address pedestrian mobility. So there will still be the standards that are set now in place. There will be more traffic. And I think the other part of it is looking at alleviators that would be, are there other ways that people can get out, all the ways that people can get out of the city more efficiently? And that's part of those discussions. Longer term, there might be a need for some flyover. I think part of that is the consequential issues. If there was a Berg Parkway, flyover, where would that land exactly? And would that actually cause more congestion for the downtown streets than not as an alleviator? Those are all part of the transportation system plan update that's going to be starting this year as well. So those will be hand in hand. The transportation system plan, transportation planning and land use planning go hand in hand together. So we end up with a plan that is concurrent so that we can see what the transportation impacts are going to be before council ends up adopting the plan, the comprehensive plan. And hopefully, that was a lot, but hopefully that helps understand that a little better.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm Mayor Brian Hodson. And to the consultant team, thank you very much. That's the piece I want to emphasize, is that these gentlemen and their teams are brought this information together. At the end of the day, it's going to be our planning commission, which there's a couple of those members here in the audience, and then it's going to be myself and the city council that are going to take this information and figure out where's the direction we're going to go, right? So the more input that we hear from you tonight, I know Council President Hensley's here, and then in future meetings, that's going to help us know what's going on so that we can determine what does affordable look like? How do we get to that level of affordable? Is that, a resetting of expectations for those that are just entering the job market, that you're not going to have a 2-bedroom apartment on your own? I don't know, but what does that look like here in Canby? So again, I appreciate you all being here and being a part of this conversation, and thank you to the consultants that we brought in to do this. And as Don has said, and Ray just said it as well, this is an ongoing conversation, because from here we do go into the transportation piece, and that is not going to be an easy conversation. We're dealing with a lot that we're having imposed upon us from the metro area and whatnot with their growth. Tolling is a heavy conversation that's going to impact us. So is it a byway? Do we toll our own road? I don't know. But what do those conversations look like coming up from a transportation, from an infrastructure? So this is just scratching the surface. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. And I'll just say, we'll take as many questions as you want. We're also happy to, when people are ready to go, to have more informal conversations around the room.
Okay, I just have two quick things. One is a question and the other is a concern. When we invite companies to come to Canby, do we have any requirement for them to hire local people, a certain number of local people? Can you hear me?
Is that on, Jamie? Yeah.
I think you have to just be closer. So the question, if you didn't hear, was when large companies come to Canby, are they required to hire locally?
You want to?
Yeah, I can. So we don't place requirements on them to hire locally. Other than when Columbia Distributing came, they did receive an incentive, and one of the aspects of that incentive is it's not the requirement, but they need to make sure that they're kind of starting locally first, not just for hiring, but also for the different workers on the jobs. And for some of that, And with hiring and with people who built the building or cleaned the building, landscaped the building, because Canby is part of a regional economy, you know, locally can be Westland, or it can be Wilsonville, it can be Canby also. And we have some new businesses in our industrial park that they're desperately trying to hire people from Canby and trying to figure out all of the ways to connect, because they moved to Canby because Canby is special and there's a lot of great things here. One of the owners of the company actually moved here himself because he fell in love with this community. And they're trying desperately to hire locally, and they're just unable to make that work just because it's so hard to find workers right now. So I think most of the companies would like to have local workers, and that I think it's for every 2 jobs that are open right now, there's only 1 person looking for a job. And so most of those companies look local first, because if you're in Canby and your commute is 3 minutes versus 30 minutes on a couple highways, and then you're going to get, you know, there's an accident, so then they're going to be late. They would much rather have local people. It's just finding those local people to hire.
And I just was going to add to that briefly. There definitely are some clusters that we're seeing here, and those are local businesses. Those are construction companies, and there's many of them. We see that through the site plan review, design review process. And it seems like industry that, like, whether it's construction or food processing, begets other food processing. For example, Caruso, Dragonberry, Lucky Foods. Those are clusters. And so we're seeing the same thing with construction as well. And so my belief is that those are local generated jobs. Do all those people live exactly in Canby? Maybe not, but I think many of them probably are within the adjacent area, or they wouldn't be developing here. But to Jamie's point, we really can't control where employees come from. No, but but we're seeing these kind of, both on distribution and these kind of clusters that are happening in Canby, and it's like, once you see that, it kind of takes off. Food processing is one in particular that we're seeing, and I think there may be more of that as well, because Dragonberry is also expanding. So.
Okay, well, my concern, I don't know if you can hear me in this. I have a funny voice.
Yeah.
My concern is, I live at the north end of Pine Street, and in the last year, I've seen on Redwood Street and on Pine Street and over on Holly Street, development happening. And when that development happens, old growth conifers and agricultural land is being covered up. And you are the planning department, and I know that you have requirements for developers, lists of them that they have to comply with. I would like to see you ask developers to preserve as much as they can the original environmental elements that on the property that they are developing. What I see is slash and burn. And there's been several acres of pine trees. I used to go out of my house and look around the horizon. I'd see pine trees. I'd hear bird song. I go out my front door now, there are no trees and there are no birds. I think that somehow we need to think outside the box environmentally, and that you are the person or the persons that can do that. You are setting the standards for how people develop our city. And I'd like to keep it rural. That's why I live here.
All good points. And just on the clear and objective standards that we have to use are what's in the current city code. There are some jurisdictions that have tree ordinances. City of Canby does not have one. So regulatory wise, that's not something we as the planning department can impose upon. But there could be, at the will of council, a tree ordinance that would be developed. Alternatively, I think on the design elements, and we like your comments on this, dealing with development in the future, maybe that does become part of the code as part of design review elements that are considered. They're currently not in the code, and Oregon in particular is a very definitive property rights state where if it's not in the code and it's not clear and objective, you have to grant the developer the permit. Unlike California and Washington that have environmental overlays on top of their permitting, Oregon does not have that. So if it's not in the zoning code, it doesn't exist. But to your point, I think that's something that absolutely could be addressed in the future as part of our development, looking at the comprehensive plan and those kinds of things, which will end up resulting in code updates anyway. We may have new zoning that we don't have now as part of that. That new zoning could be addressing unique ways of developing property. Maybe there's a mix of single family residential and multifamily, not a product that does exist in the community right now, but might be quite viable, where you'd have a mixture of housing, for example. But to your point, I think that's something as a long-term item, and we definitely want you to put your comments down, but I'm just wanting to also be honest about that as a staff, we can't just impose something that's not in the code.
I'd like to second the need for us to do something like that, though. Like, we lost 47 trees that were more than 100 feet tall to a project recently. And in the paperwork, they only said they were going to take down 7 trees. So there's a difference between 7 and 47, but we have no recourse for anything like that. And we're going to lose a lot of trees just due to age, and then we're going to lose a lot of trees due to drought, and we're not going to get as many new trees because of drought. So I really hope that we're mindful about keeping things green. It doesn't have to necessarily be huge swaths, but when we look out a window in any direction, it'd be nice to still see some bigger trees that are taller than the buildings. You know, that really is part of what makes Canby as nice as it is. Just giving some comments on the what types of businesses and jobs. We might want to consider being a little bit more intentional about not having businesses that require large trucks, because the more businesses that require large trucks, the more large truck traffic we're going to have on 99 and around town. So it might be worth considering that in terms of the mix. And then looking at other development, maybe to try and get away from doing it in downtown. My concern is I love this downtown area. I'm afraid of us getting a little bit too carried away with trying to develop it, not having the space for lots of people in the downtown area. And like when you think of Multnomah Village, I don't know how many of you guys are really familiar with that area. Same kind of thing, really cute downtown area, like nice little restaurants and businesses, and you could walk around and there's, you know, it's just a really nice area that got completely overwrought by traffic. And we're on 99, and 99 is going to get so much worse because of the tolling on 205. In the next 2 years, it's probably going to be at least quadruple what it is now. And so I just hope that, you know, that's something we're really paying attention to as we're making choices on a longer term scale. Because if we don't keep downtown as awesome as it is, that really changes the whole dynamic of the town, not just, you know, the living residential areas around it, but I feel like that is key and core to kind of what the city is. So, thanks.
Thanks.
One more question, and then I know that you guys want to work through some of these.
No,
Okay.
no.
I just didn't want to.
Yeah, no, we're okay.
I did want to say that I think Canby's design standards are woefully lacking, especially just in a lot of ways, but looking at high density, how we do these things in a way that are able to look good when they're built, but also maintain over time. And one of the things we've really been struggling with in town is when we have a community being built on an arterial, there has to be a wall created. There's no standard for what that wall is. There's no standard for maintenance on it. And throughout town, we have these walls with the section between the wall and the street is just weeds. And in most communities, there's language for that and it's addressed. And I think your predecessor or two ago said, oh yeah, that's easy. We just need to add that to the code. And Planning Commission has said, why aren't we seeing these walls? Why aren't there standards? So that's just a small tidbit of what we need to do a better job.
And this may partially answer your question. We're starting a discussion on fencing in the city right now with the Planning Commission. So that's beginning. It gets perhaps to some of that issue about, because fencing leads to design standards, which essentially go hand in hand.
Right. And with
Don, do you have time for a comment?
Yes, Parker? Yes, please, Councilor Parker.
Well, I just wanted to underscore what the mayor had to say. These are conversations that Mayor Hodson, Council President Hensley, and I had 10 to 12 years ago. And it's taken us this long to get an audience that comes in and shares these questions. I just want to give the consultants and the staff a break. What we need now are the questions that you're asking. Do we want an overpass? Do we want stricter design standards? Do we want to move away from the Western concept that you can do what you want with your property? Or can the city actually tell you not to cut down those trees? And even to micro issues of once we have a wall, who's going to take care of it? Brian and Tracy, I don't know about you, but this has been one of the most constructive public forums I've ever been to. And I just want to thank you for participating tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And my last comment, thank you, Councilor Parker, is personally, I would like, as part of this, to look at areas where we want higher density, where people can be closer to the downtown without overwhelming the downtown. Are there areas on the southeast side of 99E, not at 99E, but behind the commercial area, where there's an opportunity to redevelop? So would we create a tax increment financing zone in those areas to motivate, so we get density close to downtown so they can walk? And I think as part of that, we may want to do a pedestrian overpass so that they don't have to cross 99, but movement between downtown and the east side, where that we could do some denser housing might be a good way to approach this.
In addition to what she said, I'd like to see sidewalks finished in town. There's a lot of places children have to walk to school and there's no darn sidewalks.
And so that's a really important point. I think the safe routes to school, and I mean, every development is.
Chairs was, our bike and pedestrian committee chair was here earlier, and that is something that they consistently discuss and make recommendations to the traffic safety committee and safe routes to school program.
Well, the Public Works is actually, I mean, there's like two forms of this. Developers are putting their parts in, but Public Works is also really redoing streets. Again, it's year by year, but pretty impressive in terms of like the improvements. If you went down and talked to them at Public Works, they could give you a list. And it may not look like it's happening, but that was one thing when I first got a tour of this with a Public Works director was, this is a street we just redid, and we're driving down and like the street was built, in a way that didn't have sidewalks. Those standards now exist. You have to put sidewalks in development. Back in the day, those standards were different. And so the cities in some cases having to go back and redo that, because we can't put the onus back on the developer once they have, gone and left the situation. Yes.
Has the city looked at local improvement districts for that, where a homeowner would receive, a bond would be passed to fund sidewalks in the older sections of the neighborhood, that a homeowner would have the ability to pay for it over time? And then when they sell or whatever, want to pay it off early, then it's paid back.
There's advanced financing districts that could possibly work, but those are somewhat complicated on small scale situations, and council would need to be involved with those. I think, yes, the answer is yes. I just don't know if that's like, yeah, and I think also the money to do. I mean, there's not infinite money, and so that's the other part of that as well.
I have a question on your 20-year time horizon. The planning committee, especially Brian, every time something came before them, the traffic study is a 10-year study. We have to go back. We have to go back. And now we're going to do a new traffic study. We're doing a 20-year horizon. What in the planning, like a House Bill 2001 comes along and blows this out of the water? How are you going to And I'm not asking you with the crystal ball, but I'm asking you, what are you going to do if you've got so much set aside for R1?
I think to answer your question, the assumption is comprehensive plan should be updated about every 7 years. If there was explosive growth, instead of being 1.3%, it was more like 5%. We would have to redo our comp plan and our transportation system plan yet again. That's really the short answer of that. Would that happen in Canby at that level? It might be higher. I don't know if it would be exponentially that much higher than the PSU forecast, but it's a really good point. I've seen some bad examples of that in some communities where they became the fastest growing community in the state, and they were a sleepy town before that. And like, that's really challenging at that point. And those are kind of challenging parameters around that, and council would have a really strong role in discussing those items about like, where do we go from here on those things? Yes, sir.
But your projection, you're going to hit the thresholds for large, medium quantity cities, which then 2001 would have to be implemented.
Is this House Bill 2001? We're already there. I mean, that essentially that's the law here in this. We've had no applications for that to date, but we are subject to that, and we adopted the model ordinance because that was the least aggressive thing. And again, will we see more? My guess is we're going to see infill in that situation. We're not going to see subdivisions of duplexes. That market is not here.
And another thing, just to build, and now I'm talking to the back of you, sorry, but a traffic plan or a traffic study that's done by a developer, that is required. And you're right, it does look at, the 10 years, but the traffic transportation system plan looks overall so that we can, as we grow.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, that's a really good point. I think there's a crystal ball for 20 years, and that would be the financing that would be part of the system development charges. There's also a subset of that, which is like the fully funded projects, which is more like a 6-year plan. So what's happening when you do a plan is essentially you have your near-term projects. Those get prioritized by council. And there's a long range set of projects, because obviously the price tag, when we're going to see that for everything, we can't pay for all of it at once. So there's a near-term project list and a long-term project list. But to Jamie's point, every traffic study is done, and there's a monitoring of like the trips that are being generated by each one. There's a model that we're using DKS Consulting as a contracted provider for that, and they're keeping track of that. So we do know what those levels are, and those get measured each time. In some circumstances, there's what they call traffic smithy, where people go out and actually count cars. It's in addition to the tube counts, or they do tube counts and traffic counts.
Don, I think there's maybe also, and correct me if I'm wrong, in 20 years, projected just under 25,000. There's a whole new set of requirements, House Bill 2001 requirements, when you get to 25,000. So I think that's what he was saying. If you get there before, but I think Don's answer was the right answer is, these, by their very nature, these studies are a snapshot in time. And if things change significantly from the course that was forecasted, which is somewhat, our hands are tied a little bit by the Portland State University population forecast, then you do it again, and in order to respond to those changes.
Sorry, I missed your point there. And just to add to that, thanks, Steve. The one caveat that I think is a little bit good for Canby is we are not subject to Metro. So that, again, you're right about the next threshold, but that doesn't mean we're Metro. I mean, that stuff is way denser than we'll ever see here. I mean, but that's a really good point. Sorry, I missed that the first time you mentioned it.
Well, we're happy to, again, first, I'll echo what the mayor and others said, and thanking you all for your questions and comments. This is what we were hoping for. We're happy to stick around for the next 10, 15 minutes and have informal conversations for those who want to stick around. Those who want to go and enjoy the rest of your evening, that's great too. So however, whatever you folks want to do.
And I would just again encourage you all to grab a form and bring those back. You don't need to fill them out tonight, but we want you all to take one home. We want your input on this, and thank you again for coming.
And please sign in for the sign-in sheet. And cookies and water, take one with you. No, way to go, Diego. Good, good, good.